Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Oops, sorry about the glare. There you go. By G. Edward Griffin. And the subtitle is called A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. And this is the fifth edition. So if you have a book, you can follow with us there. If not, you can follow with us on the screen here in a minute. So this book was inspired by fundamentals. I've always been interested in finance and money and how money works and things like that. And that kind of got me into a little rabbit hole. But this is a good book to read because it's got a lot of history to it. And I think history is important. It's important to learn about our history. Otherwise, we repeat the same thing over and over. At least that's, the theory is if you know your history, you're not going to repeat it. But yeah, I don't know about that. I think human beings are pretty hard-headed. We need to be hit by a two by four more than once before we learn anything. But anyways, that's just my little sidebar there. Okay, so anyways, if you enjoy our format, you could check out our other book clubs. Mondays, we have our spiritual book clubs, and Wednesdays, we have our health book clubs. You could check those out. We have a monthly newsletter that we put out for free, so you could sign up for that and kind of follow us in terms of what we're doing, what's going on, things like that. On our website, we put all our newsletters on our website, so you could look at our past newsletters and look at that also. We have podcasts that we put out. Try to do it regularly, but I don't know. Uh, it's whoever the universe wants me to interview, but I interview some pretty interesting people, so you could check that out on our website as well. We put all our past books that we've read, as well as all our podcasts on our YouTube channel, so you could check those out. And if you like our format, if you like to read like I do, you can support us, consider supporting us if you can, but with buy me a coffee or checking out our merch. So we're working on different designs every month. So there'll be uh, so we're working on that. And so you could, come back to our website once in a while and just check things out. And then if you're local in the LA area or if you're traveling to Los Angeles area, come visit us in person in our healing center. We have a healing center that uses technologies based on Nikola Tesla, the scientist, his research on scalar waves. Um, so we use that for holistic healing for domestic animals, cats and dogs, as well as humans. So come and visit us. We'd love to meet you in person and get to know you a little better. And you could come for some R&R and some healing. So you could check those out. I have all those information as well on my website. And if you have any books you want us to recommend to read, I will leave a description link in the, I mean, a link in the description box below, and you can recommend that. We will read it at our discretion. We like classic books that have stood the test of time, that have been around for a while, that has a lot of wisdom. Uh, you know, we like to read those books. But anyways, we will consider anything that you send us our way. And yeah, we'd love to read. So this is Jekyll Island, and this will be chapter 21, and this is part one. And thank you so much for sticking with us. This is a very big book, and we're more than halfway through. So kudos to you who have stuck with us and read with us, and you guys are just a big, big, big trooper. All right. Okay, so let me move the camera in a little bit. Oops, not that close, Christina. And let us begin. All right, chapter 21. Competition is a sin. The story of how the New York investment bankers formed a cartel to avoid competition, the drafting of proposed legislation to legalize that cartel, the strategy to camouflage the true nature of the legislation, the failure of the deception, and the defeat of the bill. I hope you guys can read that. Uh, I think that's a good angle, yeah? All right. Okay, here we go. We have traveled to many points on a large circle of time and now are reapproaching the journey to Jekyll Island where this book began. In the last chapter, we saw how the expansion and contraction of the money supply following the Civil War led to a series of booms and busts. We saw how the firm of J.P. Morgan and Company, with help from financiers in London, was able to reap great profits from both sides of those cycles, but particularly from the recessions. At that point, we jumped ahead in time to examine how JP Morgan and other leading American financiers were closely aligned with British interests. We also saw how, in the 1920s, the American dollar was deliberately weakened by Morgan agents within the Federal Reserve System in order to prop up the sagging British economy. Let us return now to the point of departure and allow our cast to resume playing out that most important prior scene, the actual creation of the Federal Reserve System itself. Halfway house to central banking. Historians seeking to justify governmental control of the monetary system have claimed that the booms and busts that occurred during this period were the result of free and competitive banking. As we have seen, however, these destructive cycles were the direct result of the creation and then extinguishing of fiat money through a system of federally chartered national banks dominated by a handful of firms on Wall Street, which constituted a halfway house to central banking. None of these banks were truly free of state control, nor were they competitive in the traditional sense of the word. Of the word. They were, in fact, subsidized by the government and had many monopolistic privileges. From the perspective of bankers on Wall Street, however, there was a great deal more to be desired. For one thing, America still did not have, quote, a lender of last resort. This that is banker language for a full-blown central bank with the power to create unlimited amounts of fiat money, which can be rushed to the aid of any individual bank that is under siege by its depositors wanting their money back. Money back. Having a lender of last resort is the only way a bank can create money out of nothing and still be protected from a potential run by its customers. In other words, it is the means by which the public is forced to pay a hidden tax of inflation to cover the shortfall of fractional reserve banking. That is why the so-called virtue of a lender of last resort is taught with great reverence today in virtually all academic institutions offering degrees in banking and finance. It is one of the means by which the system perpetuates itself. The banks could now inflate more radically and more in unison than before the war. But when they pushed too far and too fast, their bank generated booms still collapsed into recessions. Excuse me. While this could be a highly profitable while this could be highly profitable to the banks, it is also precarious. As the American economy expanded in size, the magnitude of the booms and busts increased also, and it was becoming more and more difficult for firms like Morgan and Company to safely ride out the storm. There was a growing dread that the next collapse might be more than even they could handle. In addition to these concerns was the fact that many state banks, mostly in the developing southern and western states, had elected not to join the national banking system and consequently had escaped control by the Wall Street, Washington axis. As the population expanded south and westward, much of the nation's banking moved likewise, and the new banks were becoming an increasing source of competition to the New York power center. By 1896, the number of non-national banks had grown to 61%, and they already held 54% of the country's total banking deposits. By 1913, the year in which the Federal Reserve Act was passed, those numbers had swelled to 71%, non-national banks holding 57% of the nation's deposits. And that quote was from C. Coco Triumph, page 140. That's the footnote for that. Something had to be done to stop this movement. Additional competition was developing from the trend in industry to finance itself from profits rather than borrowed capital. Between 1900 and 1910, 70% of American corporate growth was funded internally, making industry increasingly dependent of the banks. But what the bankers wanted, and what many businessmen also wanted also, was a more flexible or elastic money supply, which would allow them to create enough of it at any point in time so as to be able to drive interest rates downward at will. That would make loans to businessmen so attractive they would have little choice but to return to the banker's table. Trusts and cartels replaced competition. One more problem facing Wall Street was the fact that the biggest investment houses, such as Morgan and Company and Kuhn, Loeb and Company, although they remained as competitors, were by this time so large they had ceased doing serious battle against each other. The concept of trusts and cartels had dawned in America, and to those who already had made it to the top, joint ventures, market sharing, price fixing, and mergers were far more profitable than free enterprise competition. Ron Chernow explains, Wall Street was snowballing into one big Morgan-dominated institution. In December 1909, Pierpont had bought a majority stake in the Equitable Life Assurance Society from Thomas Fortune Ryan. This gave him strong influence over America's three biggest insurance companies, Mutual Life, Equitable, and New York Life. His Bankers Trust had taken over three other banks. In 1909, he had gained control of Guarantee Trust, which through a series of mergers he converted into America's largest trust. The core money trust group included J.P. Morgan and Company, First National Bank, and National City Bank. Wall Street bankers incestuously swapped seats on each other's boards. Some banks had so many overlapping directors it was hard to separate them. The banks also shared large equity stakes in each other. Why didn't banks just merge instead of carrying out the charade of swapping shares and board members? Most were private partnerships or closely held banks and could have done so. The answer harked back to traditional American antipathy against concentrated financial power. The Morgan First National City trio feared public retribution if it openly declared its allegiance. And that quote was from Chernow, page 152 and 153. Interlocking did directorates and other forms of hidden control were far more safe than open consolidation, but they too had their limitations. For one thing, they could not penetrate the barriers of similar competitive groupings. As these combines became larger and larger, ways were sought to bring them together at the top rather than to capture the corporate entities which comprised them. Thus was born the concept of a cartel, a community of interests among businessmen in the same field, a mechanism for coming together as partners at a high level and to reduce or eliminate altogether the harsh necessity of competition. All cartels, however, have an internal self-destruct mechanism. Sooner or later, one of the members inevitably becomes dissatisfied with his agreed upon piece of the pie. He decides to compete once again and seeks a greater share of the market. It was quickly recognized that the only way to prevent this from happening was to use the police power of government to enforce the cartel agreement. The procedure called for the passage of laws disguised as measures to protect the consumer, but which actually worked to ensure the elimination of competition. Henry P. Davison, who was a Morgan partner, put it bluntly when he told a congressional committee in 1912, quote, "I would rather have regulation and control than free competition," end quote. And that quote was from, quoted by Gabriel Calco, Main Currents in Modern American History, New York Harper and Row, 1976, page 13. John D. Rockefeller was even more to be point. Uh, John D. Rockefeller was even more to the point in one of his often repeated comments. Quote, "Competition is a sin." And that was quoted by William Hoffman, David, A Report on A. Rockefeller, New York, Lyle Stewart Incorporated, 1971, page 29. This trend was not unique to the banking industry. Ron Paul and Louis Lehrman provided the historical perspective. After 1896 and 1990, then, America entered a progressive and predominantly Republican era. Compulsory cartelization in the name of progressivism began to invade every aspect of American economic life. The railroads had begun the parade with the formation of the ICC in 1880s, in the 1880s, excuse me. But now field after field was being centralized and cartelized in the name of efficiency, stability, progress, and general welfare. In particular, various big business groups led by the J.P. Morgan interests often gathered in the National Civic Federation and other think tanks and pressure organizations saw that the voluntary cartels and the industrial merger movements of the late 1890s had failed to achieve monopoly prices in industry. Therefore, they decided to turn to governments, state and federal, to curb the winds of competition and to establish forms of compulsory cartels in the name, of course, of curbing big business monopoly and advancing the general welfare. And that quote was from Paul and Lehrman, page 119. The challenge no longer was how to overcome one's adversaries, but how to keep new ones from entering the field. When John D. used his enormous profits from Standard Oil to take control of the Chase National Bank, and his brother William bought the National City Bank of New York, Wall Street had yet one more gladiator in the financial arena. Morgan found that he had no choice except to allow the Rockefellers into the club. But now that they were in, they all agreed that the influx of competitors had to be stopped. And that was to be the hidden purpose of federal legislation and government control. Gabriel Kolko explains the sheer magnitude of many of the mergers culminating in U.S. Steel soon forced him, which is Morgan, to modify his stand, though at times he would have preferred total control. More important, by 1898, he could not ignore the massive power of new financial competitors and had to treat them with deference. Standard Oil Company, utilizing National City Bank for its investments, had fixed resources substantially larger than Morgan's, and by 1899 was ready to move into the general economy. The test came, of course, in the Northern Securities Battle, which was essentially an inexpensive draw. Morgan and Standard paid deference to each other thereafter, and mutual toleration among bankers increased sharply. A benign armed neutrality rather than positive affection is as much a reason as any for the high number of interlocks among the five major New York banking houses. That quote was from Gulko Triumph, page 143 to 144. Writing in the year 1919 from the perspective of an inside view of Wall Street at that time, John Moody completes the picture. This remarkable welding together of great corporate interests could not, of course, have been accomplished if the masters of capital in Wall Street had not themselves during the same period become more closely allied. The rivalry of interests, which was so characteristic during the reorganization period a few years before, had very largely disappeared. Although the two great groups of financiers represented on the one hand by Morgan and his allies and on the other by the Standard Oil forces were still distinguishable, they were now they were now working in practical harmony on the basis of a sort of mutual community interest of their own. Thus, the control of capital and credit through banking resources tended to become concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer men. Before long, it could be said, indeed, that two rival banking groups no longer existed, but that one vast and harmonious banking power had taken their place. And that quote was from Moody, page 117 to 118, and page 150. The Aldrich-Vreeland Act. Vreeland Act. The monetary contractions of 1879 and 1893 were handled by Wall Street fairly easily and without government intervention. But the crisis of 1907 pushed their resources close to the abyss. It became clear that two changes had to be made. All remnants of banking competition now had to be totally eliminated and replaced by a national cartel. And far greater sums of fiat money had to be made available to the banks to protect them from future runs by depositors. There was now no question that Congress would have to be brought in as a partner in order to use the power of government to accomplish these objectives. Colco continues. The crisis of 1907, on the other hand, found the combined banking structure of New York inadequate to meet the challenge, and chastened by obstreperous, oh wow, what a word, obstreperous. You gotta look that up, see what that means. Obstreperous. Financial powers who thought they might build their fortunes independently of the entire banking community. The nation had grown too large, banking had become too complex. Wall Street, humbled and almost alone, turned from its own resources to the national government. And that was from Gokul Triumph, page 144. The first step in this direction was openly a stopgap measure. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which basically accomplished two objectives. First, it authorized the national banks to issue an emergency currency called script to substitute for regular money when they found themselves unable to pay their depositors. Script had been used by the bank clearinghouses during the Panic of 1907 with partial success, but it had been a bold experiment with no legal foundation. Now, Congress made it quite legal, and as Galbraith observed, the new legislation regularized these arrangements. This could be done against the security of Suntree bonds and commercial loans. This could, in fact, be turned into cash without being sold. And that quote was from this legal footnote about that. This legalized script was used only once in 1914 at the outbreak of World War I. See Galbraith, page 120. The second and perhaps most important feature of the act was to create a national monetary commission to study the problems of American banking and then make recommendations to Congress on how to stabilize the monetary system. The commission consisted of 9 senators and 9 representatives. The vice chairman was Representative Edward Vreeland, a banker from the Buffalo area. The chairman, of course, was Senator Nelson Aldrich. From the start, it was obvious that the commission was a sham. Aldrich conducted virtually, oh, sorry, got a little distracted there. Where am I? The commission consisted, the chairman, of course. Okay, I think I got it. Sorry about that. Got a little sidetracked, little distracted there. Run a little squirrel. Okay. Aldrich conducted virtually a one-man show. The so-called fact-finding body had no official meetings, for almost 2 years while Aldrich toured Europe consulting with the top central bankers of England, France, and Germany. 300,000 tax dollars were spent on these junkets, and the only tangible product of the Commission's work was 38 massive volumes of the history of European banking. None of the members of the Commission were ever consulted regarding the official recommendations issued by Aldrich in their name. Actually, these were the work of Aldrich and 6 men who were not even members of the Commission, and their report was drafted not in a bare congressional conference room in Washington, but in a plush private hunting resort in Georgia. And this event finally brings us back to that cold, blustery night at the New Jersey railway station, where 7 men representing 1/4 of the wealth of the world boarded the Aldrich private car for a clandestine journey to Jekyll Island. The Jekyll Island Plan. As summarized in the opening chapter of this book, the purpose of that meeting was to work out a plan to achieve 5 primary objectives. 1. Stop the growing influence of small rival banks and to ensure that control over the nation's financial resources would remain in the hands of those present. 2. Make the money supply more elastic in order to reverse the trend of private capital formation and to recapture the industrial loan market. 3. Pool the merger reserves of all the nation's banks into one large reserve so that at least a few of them could protect themselves from currency drains and bank runs. 4. Shift the inevitable losses from the owners of the banks to the taxpayers. 5. Convince Congress that the scheme was a measure to protect the public. It was decided that the first 2 objectives could be achieved simply by drafting the proper technical language into a cartel agreement and then reworking the vocabulary into legislative phraseology. The third and fourth could be achieved by including in that legislation the establishment of a lender of last resort. In other words, a true central bank with the ability to create unlimited amounts of fiat money. These were mostly technical matters, and although there was some disagreement on a few minor points, generally they were content to follow the advice of Paul Warburg, the man who had the most experience in these matters and who was regarded as the group's theoretician. The fifth objective was the critical one, and there was much discussion on how to achieve it. To convince Congress and the public that the establishment of a banking cartel was somehow a measure to protect the public, the Jekyll Island strategists laid down the following plan of action. 1. Do not call it a cartel or even a central bank. 2. Make it look like a government agency. 3. Establish regional branches to create the appearance of decentralization, not dominated by Wall Street banks. 4. Begin with a conservative structure, including many sound banking principles, knowing that the provisions can be quietly altered or removed in subsequent years. 5. Use anger. Use the anger caused by recent panics and bank failures to create popular demand for monetary reform. 6. Offer the Jekyll Island plan as though it were in response to that need. 7. Employ university professors to give the plan the appearance of academic approval. 8. Speak out against the plan to convince the public that Wall Street bankers do not want it. Wow, that's very subtle, huh? Subtle strategy. They create the problem and then they give you the solution. And they're betting on the public not being informed. That's why I think reading it, being informed and knowledge is so important. Sorry, just a little side note there. Okay, a central bank by any other name. Americans would never have accepted the Federal Reserve System if they had known that it was half cartel and half central bank. Even though the concept of government protectionism was rapidly gaining acceptance in business, academic, and political circles, the idea of cartels, trusts, and restraint of free competition was still quite alien to the average voter. And within the walls and within the halls of Congress, any forthright proposal for either a cartel or a central bank would have been soundly defeated. Congressman Everest Hayes of California warned, quote, "Our people have set their faces like steel against the central bank." And that quote was from Record. I don't know what PT means. Part, I don't know. PT 5, 1913, year 1913, page 4655. Senator John Shafroth of Colorado declared, quote, "The Democratic Party is opposed to a central bank." And that quote was also from Congressional Record, PT, whatever that is, 6, year 1913, page 6021. The monetary scientists on Jekyll Island decided, therefore, to devise a name for their new creature which would avoid the word bank altogether and which would conjure the image of the federal government itself, and to create the deception that there would be no concentration of power in the large New York banks. The original plan calling for a central bank was replaced by a proposal for a network of regional institutions which supposedly would share and diffuse that power. Nathaniel Wright Stevenson, Senator Aldrich's biographer, tells us, quote, "Aldrich entered the discussion at Jekyll Island an ardent convert to the idea of a central bank. His desire was to transplant the system of one of the great European banks, say the Bank of England, bodily to America." And that quote was from Stevenson, page 378. Galbraith explains further. It was his, Senator Aldrich's, thought to outflank the opposition by having not one central bank, but many, and the word bank would itself be avoided. And that quote was from Galbraith, page 122. Frank Vanderlip tells us the regional concept was merely window dressing and that the network was always intended to operate as one central bank. He said the law as enacted provided for 12 banks instead of one, but the intent of the law was to coordinate the 12 through the Federal Reserve Board in Washington so that in effect they would operate as a central bank. And that quote was from Vanderlip, From Farm Boy to Financier, page 72. If not using the word bank was essential to the Jekyll Island plan, avoiding the word cartel was even more so. Yet, the cartel nature of the proposed central bank was obvious to any astute observer. In an address before the American Bankers Association, Aldrich laid it out plainly. He said, quote, "The organization proposed is not a bank, but a cooperative union of all the banks of the country for definite purposes." And that quote was from Cruz, Volume 3, 1969, edition, page 1202. 2 years later, in a speech before that same group of bankers, A. Barton Hepburn of Chase National Bank was even more candid. He said, quote, "The measure recognizes and adopts the principles of a central bank. Indeed, if it works out as the sponsors of the law hope, it will make all incorporated banks together joint owners of a central dominating power." And that quote was from, quoted by Coco, Triumph, page 235. It would be difficult to find a better definition of the word cartel than that. The plan to structure the creature conservatively at the start and then to remove the safeguards later was the brainchild of Paul Warburg. The creation of a powerful Federal Reserve Board was also his idea as a means by which the regional branches could be absorbed into a central bank, which with control safely in New York. Professor Edwin Seligman, a member of the international banking family of J&W Seligman and head of the Department of Economics at Columbia University, explains and praises the plan. Quote, "It was in my study that Mr. Warburg first conceived the idea of presenting his views to the public." There's a footnote about that. Most historians share Seligman's view regarding Warburg's seminal role in the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Certain participants in the drama, however, apparently eager to capture some of the spotlight of fame for themselves, are in vigorous disagreement. For example, William McAdoo, Secretary of the Treasury at the time, says, quote, "This assertion is so completely erroneous that it must have emanated from ignorance rather than mendacity," end quote. See McAdoo, page 281. Sorry, I butchered that name. Competing egos notwithstanding, an objective reading of the record leads to the conclusion that while others no doubt provided great input in the areas of technical drafts and political negotiations, the essence of the plan, its overall concept, and the rationale that was put forward to sell the plan to Congress was essentially the product of Wahlberg's twisted genius. Hmm. In its fundamental features, the Federal Reserve Act is the work of Mr. Wahlberg more than any other man in the country. The existence of a Federal Reserve Board creates, in everything but in name, a real central bank. Mr. Wahlberg had a practical object in view. It was incumbent on him to remember that the education of the country must be gradual, and that a large part of the task was to break down prejudices and remove suspicion. His plans, therefore, contain all sorts of elaborate suggestions designed to guard the public against fancied dangers and to persuade the country that the general scheme was at all practicable or practicable. It was the hope of Mr. Wahlberg that with the lapse of time, it may be possible to eliminate from the law not a few clauses which were inserted largely at his suggestion for educational purposes. Hmm. Wow. Okay, we'll stop there for now. We will continue next week with part two. And I hope you enjoyed that. It was very interesting. All his sections are interesting. A little history, giving us little history of the Federal Reserve and the banking system. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed that, and we will continue next week. And I hope you guys all have a great day, great evening, great week, wherever you guys are, and we will see you next time. Okay, bye-bye now.